Hi, this is Kergan and welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This is a video about identity level change, an argument for thinking developmentally or a developmental approach. So let me set the stage here because this is an important topic. Many years ago, a friend of mine took his two sons on top of the London Eye. I can't quite remember how old they were. I think they were like 3 and 7, something like that. And one of the sons, being at the top, said, Dad, look at those small people down there. And his older brother, who was like 7, said, you idiot. They just look small. And if you've ever raised kids or know kids and, thought about this, you know that all kids seem to go through a stage where their thinking is very magical. Like, if they cover their eyes like this, they think it's really funny to play peekaboo because they can't really see that the fact that they don't see themselves physically doesn't mean that you can't see them, right? Or they might think that when you turn off the lights and they can no longer see the world disappears. Or when they're up, in the London Eye or in an airplane, people have suddenly become small. We tend to think of this as magical thinking. And then there's that phase where their thinking becomes a lot more concrete and black and white, where they're able to have a notion of durable categories, meaning, if I'm up in the plane, they just look smaller, but they're not really smaller. So from a developmental perspective, you could say that the very young kids who think magically are completely subject to their perceptions. The somewhat older kids who no longer think as magically can take their perceptions as object to some extent. By subject, I mean something that you view the world through, something that looks like reality and who you are, versus object, something you can look at and thereby have a relationship to. Now, we all recognize this with children, that you wouldn't ask a 3-year-old to understand the world or life the same way you would, say, an 8-year-old. But when it comes to adults, we have a tendency to think that an adult is an adult. A 20-year-old is a 20-year-old, or a 40-year-old is a 40-year-old. This is not true. The way things looked to the 3-year-old in the example I gave, and the way things looked to the 7-year-old marks a completely different meaning-making system. It's a very different way of understanding your experience. What most people don't know is that two adults who might both be 35 or 50, may be just as old, but they can have meaning-making systems that are as different as the 3-year-old and the 7-year-old in the example that I just gave. So I'll give you a interesting take on this. So most schools of psychology and self-help kind of acknowledge that we humans are meaning makers. We don't just receive a world, but we kind of co-construct it. We kind of construct our own experience, and we largely live in that construction. Most of these systems don't quite seem to acknowledge that when adults develop, they tend to develop in pretty predictable ways, meaning what was subject to them, and again, by subject I mean the kind of ideas that have you, that you view the world through, that look like reality, that look like who you are, when someone develops psychologically, what you are subject to suddenly becomes the object, something you can look at and have a relationship to from the perspective of the next subject. So if you can figure out what someone is subject to and what someone can take as object, that gives you a lot of information about a particular person and how to help or reach that particular person. Now, the exciting part is that there are some roadmaps that seem to show that when human beings do develop to more complex and evolved meaning-making stages, they tend to do so in a kind of sequential, pretty predictable way. There are different psychologists who didn't know each other, who operated from quite different theoretical premises, who seem to have not entirely, but pretty much discovered a very similar map to how human beings evolved. I'm thinking about people like Robert Keegan and his orders of consciousness model, which I really like. I'm thinking of people like Jane Lovinger, who pioneered ego development, whose work was then extended by Susanne Cook Greuter. And I'm talking about people like the late Clare Graves, whose work was largely popularized through the spiral dynamics framework by the late Beck and Cowan, who I used to talk to quite a bit back in the day. So even though these people didn't know each other, Keegan and Susanne Cook Greuter know each other, but even though Lovinger and Keegan and Graves, these people didn't work together, they seem to have developed maps that are somewhat different, but largely seem to point towards the same trajectory. I have found these models extremely useful in change work, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I discovered their usefulness. So back in about 2007, I saw a young Muslim woman who had a lot of internal conflict. And she described it as being teared in two. Teared in two. Like, I feel that I'm being torn in two. And what was happening was that she had gotten herself a Norwegian boyfriend who wanted her to be honest and upfront about the relationship publicly and in relation to her family. And she had conservative Muslim parents for whom the fact that she could date or even marry an infidel was completely unacceptable. It's quite politically incorrect to say this, but this is very often the norm, right? Now, the demands of her culture, on the one hand, the Muslim faith and the Pakistani culture, and the kind of demands from her boyfriend felt as an internal tearing, as if she was being torn in two. And when I attempted to help her, I was very NLP oriented back in that day. So I attempted to do something called a visual squash, where you have her kind of negotiate between the two parts that want different things. And this particular intervention fell flat on its face, and I was not really able to help her with that. And I was reading Keegan's book a little bit later, and I had this facepalm moment. Because what I realized was that her sense of self, who she fundamentally looked to be, which would correspond with what Keegan would call a socialized self, was essentially made up of her relationship. Who she was essentially made up by her relationships. That's who she looked to be. Whereas the very intervention that I presupposed presupposed and took for granted that she had a sense of self that could have relationships and relate to them. No wonder that particular intervention fell flat. There was a mismatch between her meaning-making system and the particular way that I chose to attempt to help her. Now, Robert Keegan has a book. He has several books, but he has a book called In Over Our Heads. And in this particular book, he has a chapter titled The Undiscussed Demands of Psychotherapy. And he talks about a patient called Gloria in the 60s who sought out help and who had sessions with Fritz Perls, Carl Rogers, and Albert Ellis, three of the giants of psychotherapy back in the day. And these sessions were all videotaped. And none of them were really able to help her much. And Keegan makes a very good argument in the book that they all seem to take for granted that she possessed a meaning-making system, a kind of self-authored ability to step back from her cultural context and her family and her religion and the expectancies of others, and to kind of author her own values and judgments. But in reality, she seemed to operate just like my client from a more socialized mind where her very sense of self was mostly made up of what she thought other people expected of her. And a couple of years later, I had the chance to train with Keegan, and I asked him, I said, look, you criticized Carl Rogers and Albert Ellis and Fritz Perls, but what would you do? And he said, well, I would try to secure a bridge between the kind of two meaning-making systems that would, on the one hand, kind of offer some support for where she was at and the fears and frustrations that kind of seemed to go with that, and anchor a bridge on the other side as well to engineer some way of working with her that could help her make that transition. So consider this. Consider the difference between what you could call information and transformation. If you kind of make a little space between the words and you think in terms of information, meaning you're kind of putting information into an old form, a way of making meaning which is already there, versus transformation, meaning you're helping someone to change the very form, the very way they understand something. That's what is meant by a transformation. A transformation is a developmental change. Most people don't really make these sorts of distinctions. So here's why having a good developmental map can be useful. Because once you have it, you realize that two adults who are both 45 can have vastly different meaning-making systems going on. Now, what you're subject to and what you can take as object, that's going to have a big influence on what looks real to you, what looks like reality, and what looks like it's kind of made up. What looks absolute and what looks relative. What looks like yourself or who or what you fundamentally are, and what looks like an idea, right? So when someone makes a developmental change, what looks like reality begins to look like an idea. What looked absolute becomes more relative. What looked like who they are or their self suddenly looks like a construct or an idea. So having a useful roadmap here can help you to establish rapport with someone by kind of acknowledging where they are. It can help them to it can help you to kind of determine whether you should do something to help them at the particular meaning making stage that they are, to select the framework or way of working that matches that. Uh, because here's the thing, what meaning making system people operate from is gonna largely determine how people view things such as conflict. At early meaning making stages, conflict is completely external. At later meaning making stages, conflict looks more both internal and external. It's going to determine your relationship to authority. It's going to largely influence what you can take relationship for. It's going to determine a lot about what looks like you and what looks like other or not you. You know, what's going to be your shadow sides, essentially. What can you take perspective on? You know, what is likely to be a strong either or in your world, which is where people often get stuck. Versus where can people have more of a both and perspective? How will people likely respond to feedback? You know, what are they able to hear? These sorts of things. So some interventions, some ways of working are going to be a good match with the person's current meaning making system. People often are the most happy when there's a good match between the meaning making system that they operate from and the kind of external demands. Other times, people are transitioning. They're kind of in a transition phase between two stages, or they have a life circumstance that kind of requires them to upgrade their meaning making system to be functional. Consider the difference, for example, between working in a company where responsibility is largely determined by things like showing up on time, being punctual, following instructions, doing as you're told by the manual, for example. That's one way of being responsible, versus being promoted to a position where you largely have to determine for yourself what the right thing to do is, or you have to, you know, develop a vision of sorts, or where you have to collaborate with other departments who have different objectives. This requires a different level of mental complexity, for example. So someone might be in a life circumstance where their current meaning making system is not quite sufficient for the externals demands that they're facing. So in cases like this, it's very appropriate to help someone to make a developmental shift, a transformational change on purpose. It really helps if you have a good developmental map, if you're going to try to change, have someone make a change in that way. Also, a lot of change work can be anti-developmental. You know, sometimes people are in transitional changes, and instead of helping someone evolve, a therapist or a coach might more consolidate and make them more stable in the making system that they were about to step out of or transcend, sacrificing change and development for comfort. So having a developmental map can help you make it more likely that the way you try to help someone is not anti-developmental and not way above someone's head either. So I'll give you an example of this. I remember training with John Grinder many years ago, and he would come in and, essentially deconstruct everything by saying, all beliefs are limiting, values are all made up, identity is a big trap. And while this is true enough and extremely useful for people who are moving out of a kind of self-authored meaning-making stage where they're beginning to take their very sense of self as subjects, it can be quite anti-developmental for someone who's very socialized, someone who's just beginning to find their own inner sense of self, separate from their peer group or their cultural expectations, or who's just about to find their own inner sense of authority, who can, have their own take of things. In that particular phase of development, people are likely to construct a seemingly stable, autonomous sense of self. That seems to be a part of, conventional psychological development. It's the next stage for most people. Most people in the Western world seem to be on the journey developmentally to truly develop a strong, autonomous, seemingly separate, stable sense of self, who can have good boundaries and have their own take on things and stuff like that. So if someone's just beginning that particular journey, how useful will it be to come in and begin to deconstruct all the things that particular person is just beginning to construct for themselves as a part of just regular psychological development? I just spoke to someone I know who seems to be on this journey, who said, look, I hate non-duality. I'm disgusted by it. I don't want to be, enmeshed with other people. I want to be a separate psychological self, So this person was probably introduced to such ideas at a time when they may not have been the most useful. So I hope that this little video I made here can inspire you to begin to develop something of a developmental lens. I'm doing a seminar, an online seminar this year, 2022, on the weekend of September 24th and September 25th. So September 24th and September 25th. It's online. It's hosted by ayetherandalchemy.net, Pete Dalton. You can go to my website, provocativehypnosis.com. Take a look at the seminar page. You'll see the link. And that 2-day seminar online is going to go into how specifically I apply a developmental lens when I work with clients. So my base in this is having studied Keegan's model quite extensively, ego development, and Graves and spiral dynamics. And I've kind of applied this all with clients since about 2007, when I first started reading about Keegan's work. I highly recommend getting that book by Robert Keegan, In Over Our Heads. Read the chapter titled The Undiscussed Demands of Psychotherapy. And if that resonates with you and you would like a roadmap, you would like to see how I apply this, then this seminar is going to be for you. The NLP world, much of the psychology world, the hypnotherapy world, I very seldom see someone emphasizing this developmental aspect. So it really brings, it's not the end all be all, but it really brings something useful to the arena of understanding people, connecting with people, and helping people change. So Again, if you have any comments, please do leave them, or questions wherever you find the video. And as always, I see clients from all over the world on Skype. If you'd like to do some change work, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.